we are going to talk about someone who should be familiar to you from American history, named George Washington. Now, George Washington, at the time that we are going to talk about him right now, in the years 1754 to 1763, at the beginning of this, George Washington is only about 21 years old. He has grown up. His father died when he was fairly young. His older brother got him a job as a surveyor when he was 16. He went out in the wilderness and measured out and mapped out land for the English governor in Virginia. So Washington's family was known to the governor in Virginia. And about this time, England and France began really getting on each other's nerves because of that disputed land that we talked about, especially land here in the Ohio River Valley. If I zoom in a bit closer, you can see Ohio River is right there. Both France and England claimed that land. People in Virginia, especially large landowners, were very interested in the land up in the Ohio River Valley. And as a surveyor, George Washington had been in this area. He knew Native Americans who lived there. He knew what it was like to go camp out and travel through this area. So when the French started building forts here in the Ohio River Valley, and the governor of Virginia wanted to send a message to the French that they should go away, the person that he chose to take that message was George Washington. So the governor of Virginia sends George Washington to the French at their fort called Duquesne, and George Washington is supposed to take a message to the French. His message? Get out. So that's a bit of a preview now. We'll do some more reading here. This particular paragraph will be very important for you in order to answer the assignment that we have to do tomorrow. So do pay close attention to that. The other thing that you will want to pay close attention to here is if you happen to run across any of these dates. So if we talk about any of these events and you see a year that it says they have happened, you need to write the year down so that you can keep track of these. The ones that you don't see as we talk about today, you will need to look for these on pages 272 through 275 in your social studies book. Knowing that, though, let's go back to the story. Remember, George Washington is going to be sent to Fort Duquesne with a message to the French. His message is, get out of the Ohio River Valley. What do we know about the Ohio River Valley? It lies mostly in what is now the Midwestern region of the United States. Who cares? Both Britain and France claimed the land in the Ohio River Valley. It's part of that disputed land. Until the middle of the 1700s, the Native Americans who lived there had kept both groups of colonists from settling in the valley. Then disputes among themselves and with the colonists led some Native Americans in the valley to sell their land to the British. So British colonists bought land from some Native American tribes in the Ohio River Valley. Fearing the loss of the fur trade, so this tells you why, the French began building a series of forts in the valley. Why build these forts? The French did not want to lose the fur trade. They were trading with Native Americans for furs, and the French were afraid that British colonists would start farms in the Ohio River Valley, and so the Native Americans wouldn't be able to trap fur-bearing creatures to sell to the French. So fearing the loss of the fur trade, the French began building a series of forts in the valley to keep the British out. One of those forts was named Fort Duquesne. In 1754, young George Washington was sent by the British to force the French to leave the Ohio River Valley. He goes to Fort Duquesne, knocks on the door, says, "Mr. French dude, the governor of Virginia, who works for the King of England, wants you to leave." It's where the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania now stands. When Washington arrived, when Washington knocked on the door and said, "Mr. French dude, the governor of Virginia, who works for the King of England, wants you to leave," this says he was attacked, or his troops attacked. Here's the thing. If you dig into the history, what actually happened is George Washington was marching back from Fort Duquesne when the French leader said, "No, we're not leaving." Washington turned around and left to take the message back to the governor of Virginia. He had sent his Native American scouts ahead. The Native Americans came back to him and said, "There is a group of French and their allied Indian warriors waiting ahead for us to attack us. They've laid a trap." And Washington says, "Well, it doesn't take much to figure out if they're trying to trap us. We need to surround and attack them." So yes, Washington's troops attacked and defeated that small force of French soldiers in the woods near Fort Duquesne. This short battle marked the beginning of what we know as the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War started in 1754 when George Washington was sent to force the French to leave the Ohio River Valley. Washington was not afraid. He actually didn't write this about this battle. He wrote it about the next battle. So, history books written for 5th graders aren't particularly careful to get all of the details correct. However, this is something that George Washington wrote. "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." He liked being in battle. Now, George Washington made it back to Virginia, and the governor of Virginia sends him back to the French with more men. At that point, George Washington's men get trapped. And so he builds what was called Fort Necessity. You can see from how far apart the logs are in this particular palisade that, yes, Fort Necessity was built very quickly. And Washington was only 22 years old when he led this fight at Fort Necessity. You can go and visit it nowadays. Obviously, that's me at Fort Necessity. Let's see here, go here, and we'll zoom out again a little bit. There's a view of Fort Necessity from a little farther away. You would have to stand here in order to hit someone inside the fort with a musket ball. But now we'll go on to the next page. And these bits and pieces. It did not go very well for George Washington and his troops at Fort Necessity. In fact, they were forced to surrender. Now, the surrender document was written in French. So when George Washington signed this document to say, "All right, we will stop fighting you French who have surrounded us and outnumber us," George Washington signed this document in order to allow the men that were with him to keep their weapons, their horses, their supplies. And so he was willing to sign this document to surrender. What he did not realize was that this document said that the earlier battle was all George Washington's fault, that George Washington attacked those French troops without them provoking him, without any reason. Those French troops that were setting a trap for him. But this document says, no, George Washington assassinated them. Why? Well, the leader of the attacking French troops at Fort Necessity, his brother had been killed when George Washington attacked the guys who were trying to trap him a few months earlier. And so the leader of the French forces at Fort Necessity was really wanting to make George Washington look like a bad guy. George Washington would not have signed this document if he had understood what it said, because he couldn't read French. He signed this document. That caused some problems for him later, but in the meantime, he and the army with him were able to march back across these Allegheny Mountains to Virginia. What happened then? Well, the word of this was sent over to England. And in 1755, the King of England sent his very best general. His name was Edward Braddock. He sent Edward Braddock to attack the French at Fort Duquesne again. But here's the thing. Edward Braddock and his soldiers, they were well trained, but they were trained to line up in straight lines and march across open fields. The French, as George Washington knew well, had learned from the Native American allies. They hid behind trees. They were not going to march across an open field to attack. And so even though Braddock's soldiers were well trained to fight over in England and in France, they were not well trained to fight here in the wilderness. Braddock thought he would easily win the battle, but as the British got close to Fort Duquesne, they were attacked, they were ambushed, they were trapped, just like had been tried on George Washington back in 1754. Braddock's troops broke and ran as sheep pursued by the dogs. How do we know that? George Washington was with them. George Washington tried to warn General Braddock that he was riding into a trap. General Braddock ignored George Washington. Braddock was killed in this battle. George Washington led the remaining English troops, the ones that didn't get killed in this horrible, horrible ambush. George Washington led them back to Virginia. Washington learned an important lesson from Braddock's defeat. The French were using Native American methods of warfare. They made surprise attacks on the British from behind large trees and large rocks and anywhere they could hide. The British and colonial soldiers had brightly colored jackets, and that made it easier for the French to take aim. So, 1 year after the French and Indian War began, the best soldiers under the best general that England had were badly beaten in the French and Indian War. And we will leave the war there. Your assignment today is to make sure that you go through page 272, 273, 274, and 275 in order to find the dates that these things happen. Probably the easiest way to do it is to run your finger along the page until you find a date, like this one, and then read the sentence that the date is in. In 1754, young George Washington was sent by the British to force the French to leave the Ohio River Valley. And then you look over here and see if there's anything that sounds similar to that. If there is, you put the year in the box next to it. So just skim through for the years that match these events. You will find them on page 272, 273, 274, 275. That is your social studies assignment today.